guys, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate your patience. We may still have some folks who trickle in as we keep going. For everybody out there, I think I know many of you, but not all of you. My name is Katie March. I work here at Golden History Museums. I do our education and our community outreach programs. I'd also like to give a shout out to all of our other amazing Golden History Museum staff here who really helped to plan this program. So let's give them a round of applause. We have some amazing panelists who have also helped with the planning of this program and some great partners as well. I'm going to introduce our panelists here in a minute, but before I do that, I would like to thank Terry, who is not here today, who's from the Blair Caldwell Library and has helped us with a lot of the planning as well. And then I'm also going to pass over here in just a second to Jim Kroll. And Jim Kroll is here today with the Denver Public Library, and he brought the Lorena Center collection. I'm sure some of you got to see it, but he was going to say a couple of words about that as well. You ready, Jim?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Katie. The Denver Public Library has the Lorena and Gano Center collection. The last name is spelled S-E-N-T-E-R. Mr. Center was born in Denver in 1890. His parents ran a dairy farm and a bakery in North Denver. At some point during his young years, his father killed his mother and then killed himself. Later on, his brother died of a nosebleed, and his brother's fiancée then killed herself. So there's a bit of gore to his past. However, at age 14, he and his other brother went to San Francisco, and he was shanghaied. And this is very interesting, given what happens later in his life. He signed up to work as a ship's mate, and instead, Gano was shanghaied for slave labor by the infamous Shanghai Brown. The latter sold Gano as crew to the ship. Gano attempted to jump ship several times, but was unsuccessful. When the ship landed in Alaska, he escaped, only to be taken captive by the Tlingit Indians, who sold him to the tribe of Kake, K-A-K-E. His captivity with these Native Americans resulted in his adoption by one of the chiefs, who named him Kawu. He remained with the tribe for 2.5 years. In 1907, he escaped on a ship and then came back eventually to Denver, when he married Lorena in 1911. And if you were to look at this collection without any knowledge of their involvement with the Klan, you would think that they were a typical middle-class white family. He was involved in a number of businesses, especially restaurants, but he also started the Dairy King franchise here in Colorado. And any of you have been up to Grand Junction, you probably have seen Dairy King. It's also, I've seen it in other towns in the mountains as well. He also was involved in printing of checks. That was another business he had. Lorena was heavily involved as a parliamentarian, and she taught classes in that. She also was an artist. Her art is not Picasso, but clearly she had talent. However, given all of that, in the early 1920s, Gano and Lorena began their association with the Colorado Ku Klux Klan, which was steadily becoming one of the most powerful KKK groups in the nation. One of my archivists wrote this: if I were to write this, I would not have used the term most powerful. I think that always gives the Klan this sense that they were far more influential than they actually were. They were terrorists. In 1924, a power struggle developed between the Colorado KKK, headed by John Locke, and the national organization. The Colorado KKK membership split their loyalty, resulting in the secession of the national KKK of Locke. So there was this, they became a splinter group as a result. Lorena and Gano initially supported Locke, but soon became disenchanted with him. Gano failed to receive as high an office in the new organization as he had hoped, and Lorena mistrusted Locke after allegations of corruption within the organization began to surface. The Colorado Women's Group, meanwhile, formed a separate organization and operated independently of the National Order for approximately 1.5 years. Various units slowly drifted back to the National Order. The National Organization filed suit against the Colorado Women's Splinter Group for an accounting of funds. The judge ruled that while the Colorado Organization was not responsible for payment, it could not operate as a unit of the KKK. The women, led by Lorena Center until approximately 1929, changed their name to the Colorado Cycle Club. And that's pretty much their involvement with the Klan. When we received this collection, we were surprised to find their, I don't know, what do you call these? Hoods are, yeah, I don't know if you call them a costume or whatever. But, what? Regalia? Okay. And this is one of the hoods that we have. I have on a table back here Lorena's gown that she wore as well with the insignia on it. So we have these available at the Denver Public Library. There are also other papers pertaining to their involvement in the Klan at the library as well. And so that gives you an idea as to how we got this collection and why we have it. Sure.
Thanks, Jim. Big round of applause for Jim, yeah. And I think, Jim, thank you so much for starting us off on the right foot with all of the historic artifacts, because the point of today is to have a conversation about the history of the Ku Klux Klan. I know we have a lot of Goldenites in the room talking a lot about the fact that Golden was a place that the Ku Klux Klan had a stronghold. They had meetings here. And I think that our amazing panelists are going to do a great job talking about that. I'll introduce them in a second. The only other thing that I will say, later on in the conversation, we are going to open up for questions. So feel free to be thinking about those as we go through. I will put some ground rules down really quickly. And the ground rules that we have is that we are going to try to stay talking about the Ku Klux Klan, the history of the Ku Klux Klan, and try to stay really respectful of modern politics and thinking about things that are happening today. We're going to definitely make sure that we're not bashing any current elected officials and things like that, just to make sure that we can, yeah, on your own time, but do, you know, as you would like to do. But I do want to make sure that we keep it historic and making sure that we're being respectful of everybody. So with that said, I think I'm ready to jump in and do some introductions of our three amazing panelists. I can't overemphasize how fortunate I feel that we have these three great people here today talking in Golden with us. The first person here on my left is Bob Goldberg, who is a professor of history and director of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. He's the author of 8 books, including, and this one I am told is a little out of date, that this is actually the museum's copy of his book.
More out of print.
I should say, that's true, not out of date. But this is Hooded Empire, the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado. This is actually a book, Bob, I don't think I told you this, that I read when I was in graduate school, and something that I have really used a lot in doing research and learning a lot about the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado. Some of the other books that Bob has written is Barry Goldwater and Enemies Within the Culture of Conspiracy in Modern America. He's won 12 teaching honors, including the Distinguished Honors Professors Award and University of Utah Distinguished Teaching Award. In 2003, he held the Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the Swedish Institute for North American Studies, Uppsala University. He was presented the Rosenblatt Prize for Excellence in Research, Teaching, and Service, the University of Utah's highest award in 2008 as well. And I will also point out his wife Anne is here with us today. We're really glad to have you here. She's a clinical social worker, and they have 4 sons and 4 grandchildren. So big round of applause for Bob. We really thank you for being here. Next up on our panel, I have Charlene Porter, who is a native Denverite, and in fact, her paternal and her maternal grandparents both settled here in Denver as well, in Denver here in the 1890s, which is amazing. She attended Denver Public Schools, George Washington High School. She is a proud bison, which I did not know was the mascot for Washington, D.C.'s Howard University. Charlene's journey is a really interesting one, and it's taken her from a writer, an editor, and a journalist to a film student to working at the Los Angeles Unified High School as an English teacher. In conversation, she says that this journey is what was essential to her arrival of being an author who writes books inspired by those whose shoulders we stand upon, which I think is a really beautiful phrase. Charlene's debut novel, Bold-Faced Lies, which I have a copy of that one here to continue my show and tell. Beautiful cover. I've lost my place, though. Wait a minute, is a Denver Post #1 local bestseller. And she's currently working on an Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences sanctioned visual biography of Hattie McDaniel, who also grew up in Denver as a child actor and is known for her co-starring role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind and for being the first actor of color to be nominated for and win an Oscar. So let's give Charlene a round of applause. And last and certainly not least, I'm very excited to have Theo Wilson here. Theo Wilson is a Denver-based poet, actor, speaker, and activist, and I'm sure you can keep going on with those explanations on those too. He's also known by his poet handle Luciferi and attended Florida A&M University, where he attended a BA in theater performance. Theo is a founding member of the Denver Slam Nuba team, who won the National Poetry Slam in 2011. He began his speaking career in the NAACP, and this just amazes me, at the age of 15. And he has always had a passion for social justice. He teaches and lectures on poetry with the Art from Ashes nonprofit poetry therapy organization. His recent TED Talk, which is really fascinating if you haven't seen it, I can't hold that one up to show, but discusses his experience going undercover with the modern online Ku Klux Klan, where he learned about the revisionist history and racist views of members from this underground community. Theo is also the executive director of Shop Talk Live, a group that hosts discussions in Denver area barbershops and beauty salons about issues facing African American communities here in Denver. So let's give Theo a round of applause as well. I'm really excited to see the different perspectives that our panelists can bring, and I think we can just kind of jump on in with our first question, which I had slated for Bob, but as we go through, if you guys have anything to jump in and say, feel free to do so. But Bob, so you wrote the book Hooded Empire, as we discussed, and which is one of very few resources on the history of this group in our state. Can you start off by just kind of giving us an overview explanation about how the Klan began and later grew into such an influential organization here in Colorado?
Sure, and let me give some context. If, Katie, I go too long, stop me.
I promise.
Okay, because all historians just live in context, all right? Okay. So when people hear the words Ku Klux Klan, their minds usually conjure up the South, a night-riding organization bent on intimidating blacks in the South, newly freed blacks after the Reconstruction, during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, or in the period from 1944 to the 1960s, waxing and waning with the Civil Rights Movement. That image of the Ku Klux Klan fits the first Klan movement and the third Klan movement. It does not fit the second Klan movement. And the second Klan movement is the one basically we're interested in regard to Golden in Denver, Colorado. This was a movement of the 1920s. It was a national organization which recruited between 6 and 7 million men and women across the country. The Klaverns, or chapter organizations of the Ku Klux Klan, were strongest not in the South. Maine had a larger Ku Klux Klan than South Carolina, but were most powerful in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, and California. The focus, a smorgasbord of opportunities. The people who were supposed to sell the Klan were called Kliegels, and Kliegels were paid on a commission basis. So they were asked to go into all these towns across the United States and in Colorado, stay a couple of weeks underground, and then come up with the problems that this community was facing, and then sell the Klan as the solution to the problems in that community. So Going across Colorado, when I did for my book, and going across the United States and other works I've done, you'll find that the Klan fit itself to a particular community. It was like a chameleon. So in Denver, for example, the Klan was very upset about, because the people were very upset about, law and order problems. There were problems with Catholics, according to some Klansmen. Gano Center, for example, in his cafe downtown Denver, had a sign on the window which said, "We serve fish every day but Friday." Basically, a message to the Catholics to stay out of this piece of Klanhood and Klandom. Okay? Gano Center also was a member of several anti-Catholic organizations going into the 1920s. So Kliegels would find out what was going on and then find out who to talk to. They'd go to the Masonic Lodge. They'd go to Protestant churches and Protestant leaders, and they would go to police forces, and those would be the earliest recruits. Law and order, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and also issues of white supremacy, also particularly in Colorado, because the new Negro, as blacks were called after World War I, was emerging and disrupting the racial status quo. Stop.
That sounds good. Yeah. So part of that too. So one of the things that we talk a lot about. Is that Colorado was really impressively. I believe I read in your book that it's the second largest population of Klan members in the United States.
Not the second largest, because you have several states like Indiana, Texas, and Pennsylvania, which had hundreds of thousands of Klan members. Klan in Denver was approximately 17,000 members, another 17,000 for the entire state. But per capita, that was a large population. The other thing that stands out about Colorado in particular is after Indiana, the Klan was most politically powerful here. The Klan was a political machine. So what it would do was make sure, come election day, to quote John Galen Locke, as he said, "We are not Democrats, we are not Republicans, we are Klansmen." And Klansmen would be told how to vote in a particular election for a particular candidate, and then Klan power and Klan emphasis would then be felt. Klan always made sure that women in particular would organize voters, get them to the polls, get them registered, and make sure they voted. One other piece I think is fairly interesting about the Klan and political Klan in Colorado is on election day they would put in every mailbox and under every door what was called a pink sheet. And a pink sheet listed everyone who was running for office and listed them as Catholic, too friendly with Catholics, 100% American, Jewish, those people you wouldn't vote for, so you knew exactly who you were going to vote for. 2 United States senators, lower house of the state legislature, and many mayors and city councils throughout Colorado were run by the Klan.
Well, I'm really interested in digging in. You mentioned some of the law and order stuff, women's involvement with the Klan, political power, and we have some questions about all those too. But I think I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Charlene. Your book, Bold-Faced Lies, is a fiction, and I was just telling Charlene earlier, I hadn't read it before we started this panel, and I picked it up thinking that I was going to kind of peruse it and skim over a couple of sections just to get a familiarity, and I started and I read the whole thing in one evening because it's a fantastic book. And I'll also put a plug out there that she does have some copies here today. If you're interested in picking up one, you can stop by the desk on the way out. But to get back to, a little pitch, just because I'm a big fan. But so your book, Bold-Faced Lies, it's a fiction novel that takes place in 1925, and it's about the wife of an ambitious Klan leader and what happens when she learns that she herself is 1/4 Negro. What inspired you to write the book? And did you have any specific historic incidents or events or things that really kind of inspired the story?
Thank you. First of all, everyone, I really appreciate you being here. This is an important discussion. And thank you, Katie and Megan and Nathan and just everybody. Just thank you, Bob, everybody. I grew up hearing my parents and their friends. My parents were, and their parents, my parents' grandparents were all born and raised in Denver. And so were most of their friends. So as a child, I'd be around the conversations that they were having, and I would hear them reference the Ku Klux Klan. And when I decided to return to my efforts to be a writer, the idea came to mind about the Klan in Denver, which I said, well, I must have been imagining things, because Denver and the Klan, that couldn't be possible. And as you can see by my appearance, I'm commingled with various backgrounds. Both of my grandmothers look white. Now, there's a thing called passing in the African American experience, because legally, if you had 1 30-second, I personally believe all blood is just blood, but in the legal system, if you had 1 30-second of black blood, you were considered African American, which meant you were denied job opportunities, you were denied educational opportunities, you couldn't live certain places. One of my father's dearest friends used to have to get out in a bus that his father was driving, the friend's father was driving, and he had to pretend he didn't know his father because his father was passing for white, so he could have a job as a bus driver. So passing was part of my life. My grandmother's, one grandmother, I'm pretty sure, they look white, but they had to live as African Americans. So actually they were what we call white, but again, because of the 1-drop rule. And this was just very prevalent in the situation I grew up in. Lots of people had lots of very hurt experiences because of all this. So my father was born in 1924, so I realized if his mother was passing for white, then probably many other, and I knew that many others were passing back and forth. It was just how it went. So I said, well, once I did my research and I found out that the Klan did indeed control Denver in the 20s, it was probably logical that somehow someone was involved in the Klan who was legally African American. So that's where the story came from. And then I did extensive research, and it was just mind-boggling, such as the women's group. And I read in Bob's book that there was a Klan women's group march in Arvada that had 10,000 women strong. And the last photos of my father were taken by a friend, Pat Duncan, with the Lorena Center collection. And my theory was that if he was alive, he was 82, that the hate that they taught was still alive. And indeed it is. So that's how I came to write the story.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting. Theo, I'd love to chat with you a little bit too about some of the work that you've done. And I know from watching YouTube videos and some of the talks that you've given that you're an avid student of history as well. And you place a lot of value in understanding history in order to understand our modern world. As we mentioned, you discussed in your TED Talk that you went undercover online with the modern Klan. So I'm kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about what role you saw history, historic knowledge, and kind of historic pride play in the conversations that you witnessed between people who either identified or were part of the group that we would call the modern Klan.
You know what's interesting? America has an aversion to teaching its history the right way. If it did not have that aversion, good folks like these wouldn't have to do what they do. And in that absence, the momentum of the idea of whiteness takes a hold. And that idea is an idea of a type of purity and innocence. And you don't get the full context of what kind of blood was spilled. I often say America is Rome pretending to be Greece. Meaning that there was a whole lot of bodies that got chopped up to make this here sausage of democracy. And it likes to pretend as if this was got through a hardworking Protestant ethic. It's not so. So when these kids come up, because you were right, the hate is still alive. It's the environmental learning piece that got these millennial racists to where they are. They didn't learn it with Martin Luther King being a person with a holiday. They didn't learn it with Michael Jordan posters everywhere like when it was when I was growing up, and Cosby on the airwaves back before all this madness. What it was the dinner table conversations. What it was the things that were said around Thanksgiving. These factors that made a lens. And you know, one of the fastest ways to the subconscious mind is through authority. If your daddy say it, it goes. If your uncle say it, it goes. you know, the crafting of the white victim narrative. That somehow the blowback of 500 years of apartheid, 500 years of conquest was now oppression against white folks. Got framed up in the absence of history to a brand new generation who, with the advent of the internet, could get a hold of any sort of facts that somebody could simply upload. And with the echo chambers being what they are, all you need to be in a hateful position is socially reinforced into that position. That's all you need. And with enough people backing you up, human beings are capable of all manner of evil. And the online communities make sure that they don't even have to leave the safety of their own bedrooms. And that's what I found. And that, to me, was especially dangerous. And I think that is worth addressing. So thank you for having me on this panel.
Thanks, Theo. I'd love to kind of, I have a lot more questions about how to make some changes going forward and to talk about some of those as well. But Bob, I'd love to kind of go back a little bit more
Sure.
and ground in the history to talk more about what the specific goals of the Klan were in the 1920s here in Colorado, was, politically, socially, and otherwise, and kind of learn a little bit more about what they were trying to accomplish.
Sure. Let me put that on two levels. Let me talk about Denver and the community level, and then maybe talking about the state legislature, because again, they control the lower house of the state legislature. They elected the governor, lieutenant governor, and the attorney general for the state. You can't hear me.
So those microphones are just for television.
Oh, I thought they were just for show. Okay. All right. I'm sorry, I'll speak louder, okay? So when the Klan came to Colorado and came to Denver in 1921, it had a list of agenda items, having perused the community, spoken to these leaders in the community. What's bothering the folks in Denver? What can we sell the Klan as a solution, as a remedy to the problems facing your community? I mentioned the law and order problem. There was a law and order problem across the United States because Prohibition had just gone into effect, and a whole lot of folks didn't want to quit drinking. This led to not simply drinking, but also a great deal of violence. So there was a question about the violence in Denver in regard to Prohibition violations, law and order. Part of this problem also was the fact that people in Little Italy continued to like their wine. And people in Jewtown or Little Jerusalem in the Jewish community also didn't necessarily follow a Protestant issue in regard to morality. So immigrant groups, minority groups, were also involved in the law and order issue. Okay? But I remember Gano Center, back to him for just a moment, saying, and I quote him, the Jews and the Catholics were taking over, so we had to go down to the Masonic Lodge and organize, and that's just what we did. So the idea that Catholics and Jews had too much power, Jews were like Jonahs on the ship of state and couldn't be trusted. The Catholics weren't here of their own free will. The Pope had sent the Catholics to America in order to take over Protestant America and allow the Pope to then come and establish his rule here. And in Canyon City, Colorado, they believed that the abbey that was under construction in the 1920s was going to be the summer home of the Pope in the West. Okay? So there were those issues about Catholics, about Jews, and also African Americans. African Americans protested the showing of Birth of a Nation here in 1915, which is a movie, if you haven't seen it, is a pro-Klan movie that the Klan used to open its recruiting drives throughout Colorado and through the United States. African Americans were also seeking integration of municipal administrative outlets, the tennis courts, for example. The municipal auditorium was segregated. School activities were also segregated. And also at this time, some black families were attempting to move out of their ghetto into white areas. There was at least 2 bombings, and there was also one mob action which cast these people out of the neighborhood. So the Klan in Denver had a whole lot of things that it could concentrate on, a whole lot of issues, from worrying about the children, worrying about property values, worrying about the Catholics and Jews, worrying about law and order, worrying about a corrupt administration in Denver. When the Klan took over the state state legislature, their focus was with the following slogan: every man under the Capitol dome a Klansman. And the idea was, let's get rid of everybody who's not a Klansman by abolishing all the boards of the state government, abolishing the boards and then recreating them so you can only appoint Klansmen to these boards. So the idea was put Klansmen on guard as opposed to any necessarily noxious legislation. I should note this also, Klan legislators put forward a child labor law, put forward a law to allow women to be jurors, put forward a law in regard to minimum wage for women. So you have a variety of complexions in regard to the Klan, in regard to its activities.
Please.
Bob just referenced the duality of the Ku Klux Klan and who they were. If you go down and see the Lorena Center collection, they were very convivial people. Thank you notes and luncheons, and as Jim said, Lorena Center was a parliamentarian. She was a club woman. But I kind of wanted to reel back just a little bit. Bob referenced Birth of a Nation, which has a little ironic history. Douglas Fairbanks Sr. is also born and raised in Denver. He began his acting career here at the Elitch Gardens. He was considered the first king of Hollywood. He helped found the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and he married Mary Pickford, and D.W. Griffith and Charlie Chaplin were his partners in United Artists. Now, I can't confirm this, but there's a biography out about Douglas Fairbanks Sr., and it would seem to indicate that the author is saying that Douglas Fairbanks' mother was passing for white. So the irony, that he was involved in the founding of Hollywood, but yet he was probably impersonating his identity. It's all so convoluted. The attitudes, you can see myself. I'm pretty much I try to get along with most everyone, but I've had myself experience when I lived in California. I had divine direction. I was attending two churches. My church that's historically African American, and then I was sent to a Presbyterian church, so I was going to both churches for 5 years. And I would always introduce myself. I was the only African American person at this Presbyterian church, and I would always introduce myself to everyone. So one Sunday in the pew, I extended my hand to the persons next to me, and the gentleman shook my hand, and I further extended my hand, and the woman and then she drew her hand back, and her, I think, husband said, she said, no. So this was stunning. This was in La Cañada, California, just over the hill from Pasadena, which is, but I experienced, my thought was, well, if you're doing this to me, I'm a mild little, quiet, light-skinned black lady, what are you, really doing? But she was adamant. She was not going to extend her hand to me.
Charlene, I think that's a really interesting segue to talk a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the members of the Ku Klux Klan and how the Ku Klux Klan operated, but I would be really interested to talk some about what the communities that they were targeting experienced due to the Ku Klux Klan. And I know you talk a little bit about this in your book and some of the people who were affected, but what was it really like to be a member of one of these communities that Bob's mentioned? If you're Jewish American, you're Catholic, you are an African American, you're an immigrant, what do you think it would have been like in the 20s to be part of that?
Well, I can only speak from hearing the stories, but my father was born in Denver on 3rd and Ray Street. His father's mother owned a little home there. I believe there was a small African American community within the country club district. So that's the country club district. And I'm assuming they were the domestic workers to the wealthy people. And my father used to caddy for the Denver Country Club, but he couldn't, of course, play there or belong there. And one day, my father had taken me to one of his Rotary meetings, and a gentleman asked, Bill, where were you born? And I just piped up, I said, 3rd and Race. He said, no, I mean, where were you born? I said, well, 3rd and Race. He said, no, where were you born? I said, I was born, and my father said, 353 Race Street. And the man, it just couldn't be that my father could be born in the country club district. Just couldn't be. So one day I was driving down Spirit, and I realized no matter how hard my parents worked, no matter what they did, no matter how many degrees they got, no matter how polite they were, no matter what. They could not have the American dream. And I attended Smiley Junior High School, and I used to think that the white students didn't like us because they went out one side of the school and we went out the other side of the school. And it wasn't until I came home as a grown person that I realized, oh, their homes were over there, which were larger, more space in the backyards. Ours were more modest. Because my mother wanted to be a teacher. They did not hire African-American teachers, period, full-time. You could get a substitute job, but you could not get a full-time job, period. Could not get a contract. My father, who was pretty much raised by his white grandmother, who was disowned by her family for marrying a black person, he used to say that when white people say equal, they don't mean that equal. So, and again, the residue of, I've seen so much pain, just so much pain. There's a photo I wish I had brought of my father. He's sitting he worked for Colorado State Employment. He's one of the 4 area managers when he retired. And he's sitting among, he's the one single black person. And I know the struggles he went through. And he constantly had to be on pins and needles about every single thing he did. And of course that came home, So.
Thea, I wonder if you might want to weigh in on that one a little bit too and talk a little bit about what the kind of lasting impacts are of having subdivided neighborhoods and the kind of things that were implemented because of racism in Denver, in Golden, in Colorado generally.
I think one of the things we seldom think about is the fact that there are people at all who could mark their name as white on any census is actually due to racism itself. It is because of the breeding border that it was supposed to be. It is the fear of miscegenation. It is the fear of the genetic annihilation that these measures were taken. When you think about the effort to even sew one of these costumes together, when you think about the effort that it takes to legislate, when you think about the effort it takes to get together in mobs and burn and lynch folks, you're looking at a level of attachment to an ideal that often shows up in the phenotype of European people. And one of the things that I think has lasted with us is the fact that it's the same principle. Who's ever worked with kids before? You ever worked with kids? If you keep telling the kid he's a bad kid, you're a bad kid, you're a bad kid, what does that kid then internalize? So in my generation, I grew up, the thing I was afraid of most was gang warfare. But what did we call each other? N-word this, N-word that. That is a part of the learning process that says black bodies are less valuable. It's easier to kill each other. And that showed up in the crack era that I guess I'm now, fortunate to survive. But we don't connect them. We don't connect them. The element of transgenerational trauma that says that I learned that my life was worth less, I'm not even going to try, becomes a learned helplessness, right? And so in the arguments that I would get in on YouTube and whatnot before I went undercover, hey man, we got Barack Obama, he's president, right? Oprah Winfrey and Colin Powell and LeBron James, you don't have any more excuses. And one of the interesting things that I think that is often missed on people is I could flip it as like, well, you're white, how come you're not Mark Zuckerberg? You know what I'm saying? You with all this opportunity, right? How we are all different capacities. But the issues that I find that hurt the black community most from this era is that things that are human behaviors when placed into poverty have become racialized. The idea of black on black crime. All races kill each other more. It's a phenomenon called proximity murder, an entirely human thing. But the fact that that got racialized was to say, look, it's not us doing it. White folks didn't do these murders, right? And then we bought into it. We live it and we feel it. And so this entire Black Lives Matter situation is like an affirmation to us, ourselves. Dude, we matter. We matter, we matter, we matter. Our lives matter. Let's start holding people accountable to our own lives. The fact that that gets interpreted as a battle cry is the most interesting thing of all. I'll stop there.
Katie, can I add to Theo's comment? I'm still at my place in life, struggling to be who I might really be, because I wasn't permitted to be. I went to George Washington High School.
So did I.
And quite some time after I did. And it just I wasn't, it wasn't done to be a black cheerleader at that time, or to have aspirations, or it was illegal for a black and a white person to have a relationship. I mean, literally illegal. So, I've kind of had to deconstruct myself and try to see if I can put the pieces back together authentically. So you asked what the stress was then. So I've also become aware that slavery was not a career option. It was not a career choice. It was enslavement. And so if everyone would consider, when they say the slavery, it was enslavement. People's lives were stolen. Not just, so what was that person really? Were they an architect? Were they a teacher? Were they an artist? What were they really? All that's hundreds of years washed, stolen from all of us. Because who knows what those people really, really were. I mean, my father and mother, same thing. They couldn't be. My father went to the University of Denver, and at the time, he wanted to be an architect. They didn't admit African Americans to the School of Architecture. So when I said, Dad, I want to be a writer, he said, you can't. It wasn't our practical, it wasn't, what, are you losing your mind? So it's not just then, it's, ongoing.
Charlene, that makes me think a lot about the idea of power and the idea of who has power in a community. And I think that really makes me think back to the idea that in Colorado in the 20s, there was one group that had a lot of the power. And so I was hoping, Bob, could you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned when we started about law enforcement and about people who were part of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, political leaders and things like that. What was the power that they had through either organizing and also just through the realities of race relations in Colorado in the 1920s?
Sure, I want to talk about that in several ways. We've talked a little about the political power. The Klan exercised enormous political power and had at least opportunity to make law that would have been incredibly disruptive to the communities. They weren't able to do that for a variety of reasons. But having power to, as I said earlier, requisition police vehicles for Klan parades or for Klan dignitaries coming into the city is a real sign of control and authority. The idea that you can burn crosses on hilltops, whether as we're here or a terrorist threat or an announcement, is also something when you're not punished for that because the police, which has already been infiltrated by the Klan, is not going to arrest you. But let's go a couple other things. I mentioned Gano Center's sign on his window about basically no Catholics allowed. Because the Klan was also an economic machine, people would join the Klan, shop owners would join the Klan, and they'd get a little sticker they could put on their windows. And the sticker was KIGY, which meant Klansman, I greet you. So you knew that was a Klan-approved store. There was a boycott of Catholic and Jewish stores. So just the daily life of going downtown to shop in Denver indicated you could be on one side versus the other. When I talked to Klansmen and anti-Klansmen in the small towns, what they told me about was the fact that Klan met every weekend. But what was so interesting to so many of these people as a memory was the Klan sheets that were done on the washing. In other words, they hung out to dry out of somebody's house. There was no fear or anxiety that you were going to know that I was a member of the Klan. They wanted you to know that they were members of the Klan because that exerted authority. And so everyone knew who was who and what was what. And you knew where to stay away and who to go to approach. So that type of psychic power, economic power, political power, social power was something that is not so much talked about in regard to the Klan. But when the Klan controls a community, its power is manifest. And I just want to mention one other example of official Klan power. So when the Klan controlled the courts, what the Klan would do would stuff its membership list into the jury wheels. So in other words, you would have a jury of Klansmen who would decide your fate. Okay? That to me is as powerful as you could possibly get in the judicial system.
And you think of the people who tried to resist that. You know, they were threatened with the loss of their jobs or harm to their families. So it was so widespread and so deeply entrenched. There's so the hubris that they would know that Benjamin Stapleton was Klan number 1,128. They, you know, his name is on the roster, and yet they would still name an entire community after him. Now, what does that say? I mean, really, what does that say?
May I add something to this specific discussion? It has to be said now. 2008, the FBI's counterterrorism wing issues a memo across the country warning police officers of infiltration from white nationalist groups. In 2008, and almost nothing was done. There was a couple of cases where these guys, you know, messed up and, you know, showed their hand that these guys got convicted. But up until the shooting, remember the big shootout in Dallas last year?
So many.
The big one. One of the cops who got killed in there in that shootout had a tattoo on his ring finger that was an insignia of white nationalism. So me as a black man right now, today, is thinking about, is the cop pulling me over a covert member of a white nationalist group now? That is my life now. You see what I'm saying? And the thing that hurts me is that, dang it, my grandfather's a Tuskegee Airman, certified red tail, fought for this country to defeat the Nazis. And in that interaction, that may not matter. You see what I'm saying? So I got a right to be an American as anybody else. And the fact that I'm still living under this means that can't stay silent, got to talk about it. At the very, very least, put it out in the public consciousness.
The Ku Klux Klan was started 1 year after the end of the Civil War on purpose to intimidate, terrorize, kill, suppress the free people that had been enslaved. So my contention is that the Civil War never ended. I mean, I guess, you know, the history books say that it did, but this group has insisted that it did not, and we're not having it. You know, we're not, no. And I still think a lot of people, as Bob mentioned, you know, that there's a romanticized myth that the Ku Klux Klan is in the South. It's the mint juleps and the, I think some people secretly want their own plantation, whether it's, you know, vicariously they live. No, I really do. I mean, I sincerely think that they think they should have the opportunity to be slaveholders and plantation masses and what have you. So we're fighting. There's so much. And it's on so many levels. So the history, you know, the fact, you know, to keep it historical, that people could for hundreds of years enslave people here and build wealth and torture people and build. I read just a couple of days ago, I did not know this, or maybe had learned it but forgot it, that in 1881, the Native Americans, Cheyenne maybe, were removed from their land, and in 1882, that land was offered to the new white settlers. Now, how, you know, that's about as unrighteous as you can possibly get. So I think what's happening, connected, as I think Theo referenced, so this country was built illegally, and not only illegally, it was at the sacrifice of others' lives. So I think what I personally, this is my conclusion, that everybody knows that, and they're afraid that the reckoning is coming. and they don't know what to do because they know the reckoning is going to be pretty serious because the crime is pretty serious.
We're gonna wait.
local historian.
Hold on.
I've got some
Hold on.
questions.
We're gonna wait and hold questions until the time comes because we still have a little bit more time to do our questions here. But I'm really interested, guys. Charlene, you mentioned talking about the fact that the Klan wasn't just in the South, and the fact that you talk about plantations, and people don't always think about Colorado or Golden as
No,
being a
they don't.
place
I didn't.
where that happens. But so I kind of would be interested to talk a little bit about, and maybe we'll start with Bob, and if you guys want to weigh in as well, that during the second wave of the Klan during the 1920s, why Colorado? Why was Colorado so ripe for folks coming in and banding together like this? Why do you think it happened here?
Yeah, so Colorado, in a sense, got a jump start in 1921. The Imperial Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, a man by the name of William Joseph Simmons, who is the founder of the recreated Klan in 1915. He's the one who went to Stone Mountain in Georgia, lit the Burning Cross, timed, of course, the birth of a nation, which was opening in Atlanta, okay, because media and real events occur continuously and connectedly in the 20th century. He came as a special visit to, went to the Brown Palace Hotel where he swore in 15 or 20 Ku Kluxers. John Galen Locke was one of them. So you had, first of all, a good, powerful leadership corps who basically directed their own Kliegels. And as I said earlier, the mission of the Kliegel was go to a town, stand to cover, sell the Klan to the problem that exists in the town. And as I also said, the Kliegels worked on a commission basis. So the more people they got into the Klan, the more money they got. So they were incredibly motivated, or to quote William Joseph Simmons, they made America hum all over. Okay? So depending on where you were, with Denver, you had across the board of possibilities that the Klan could answer. White supremacy, militant Protestantism, law and order, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, anti-African Americans. Okay? Then you'd go to a place like Grand Junction, and Grand Junction didn't play on law and order, had only a few black folks there. Jews and Catholics weren't seeming to cause a stir. So a man by the name of William Walker, who was the head of, who ran the newspaper and one of the lead of the town, said, you know what, we need a good fraternal organization here. So the Klan became the newest and best fraternal organization that you could have. And I remember interviewing one Kluxer who said his hands used to shake. He was so excited as he was trying to button his robe because he was going to be entering this mystical fraternal world. So that was a key factor here. If you go down to Canyon City, I mentioned the issue of the Pope having his summer residence there. But there's another piece there. There was a courthouse gang that the Klan was opposed to. The courthouse gang which refused to raise taxes, to fix the roads, put sewers in, put sidewalks in, and modernize the school. So they supported a Democratic-Republican joint ticket of progressive move and change for civic responsibility. So that was the need there. The thing about the Klan, regardless of where you were in the country, the Klan fit itself to what you needed. Whether you were a longtime resident in Denver who had children in the high school and you were worried about them mixing with the wrong types, okay? Or there was an issue briefly about drugs being given to high school students in Denver. So here the Klan was saying, governments are not responsive, governments are corrupt, the police can't be trusted, they're on the bribe, they're on the dole. What we need to do is basically reestablish everything. Not make America great again, but certainly make America better again.
Bob referenced the fraternal enticement of the Lakeside entertainment park. So one day I like to walk around, just look at neighborhoods and what have you. And right next door to Lakeside is a racetrack. And I recognized it from the day at the Klan. There's a photograph, the Western History Division has it, the day at the Klan. It's the same racetrack where they had these Day at the Klan gatherings and picnics and what have you. So if you go and see that, you can pretty much envision the history. But I guess Denver was very industrial. You know, people worked in mills and breweries and what have you, and there were a lot of new settlers. My father told me that after the war, you know, a lot of people had come out here, were based out here and liked it and but they brought their Southern, sentiments with them. And these were people who maybe weren't high on the economic ladder, but they found a way to make themselves feel better about themselves. So they could be a Kliegel or just a whatever in the echelon of the Klan hierarchy, which they couldn't be a Denver Athletic Club member or a 17th Street Club. I can't think of the name. It's something like that. You couldn't belong to the Denver Country Club. I don't know if everyone remembers Marvin Davis when he moved out here. Does everybody know? He's the oilman. And so the Polo Grounds, does everyone know where the Polo Grounds is in Denver? Most people do not. It is where the old white money lives. It's on York Street. It's just south of it's surrounded by hedges. It's where old white money lives. So Marvin Davis wanted to move into the Polo Grounds. They said, "You're Jewish." We don't think so. In fact, absolutely not. And so then he, had to move to Cherry Hills or somewhere like that. He created this carousel ball to try to, show them, well, I'm big and powerful and important and connected to Hollywood. But they don't care. It's an old culture. The culture is very ingrained. It's very secret. I mean, the old. I'm not saying that because you have white money, because you're old and have white money that you're racist. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that there are subcultures within the we don't even just generally know about. So the history, it's so strong. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, the events, these summer extravaganzas that the Klan had, the whole family was invited. That would draw 20, 30, 50, 70, 100,000 people, depending on where you were in the country. Not just only Kluxers, but also people who were just sympathetic to the Klan and were happy to be around white Protestant white folks. Mm-hmm. So the Klan also had a children's organization. Okay, anybody who had money, the Klan was interested in you. Okay, so the children had their piece of this. There was a 100-piece Klan band in Denver. Okay, which serenaded Klansmen and Klanswomen as they went to these events. So there was a real social aspect to the Klan. One other piece I wanted to make was that, so I was able to look at the membership list and I did a statistical analysis of the people who joined. And what I found was there were very few people who came from the South to Denver and were joining the Klan. Klansmen were homegrown. They were longtime residents. They weren't just here 1 or 2 years. They weren't young people. Their average ages were 30 to 40 years of age. They were family men. They were married men. And they had jobs. So this wasn't a poor people's organization. The very rich are not there. The very poor are not in the Klan. But otherwise, the Klan is a cross-section of the white male population in Denver in the 1920s. This was a mainstream organization. Okay? This wasn't an extremist organization. This was a mainstream organization that looks to its roots back to the Know-Nothings of the 1850s, the American Protective Association in the 1890s, and I think you can make some arguments as to where they might be right now. But it was mainstream.
I think that's the scariest thing about it, right? We want to make them these backwoods crazies.
Mm-hmm. Weird people with hoods on.
Weirdos. Extreme nut jobs. They weren't and aren't.
Reference there for his academy this week.
There is it's a thing where you have to begin to understand that. Here's the thing. All cultures, all people, doesn't matter your race, need cultural roots in some way, right? This is what I learned online. Everybody needs cultural roots in some kind of way. Doesn't matter, right? And when you reach for those cultural roots, what do you find for white folks? See, I'm black, I'm African American, right? So I can reach toward a history of valiant struggle against oppression. I can reach for that history. And further back, I can reach for people who are engineers, mathematicians, and whatnot on the continent, right? And a Native American say, I come from people who fought valiantly against. When you're white, what do you have to reach for? Well, there's this wall of whiteness before your real history actually starts. And one of the things I suggested to Jared Taylor of American Renaissance, one of the chief white supremacist intellectuals in this country when I was talking to him, is that maybe the idea of whiteness itself, this Heinz 57 of all these European immigrants, is indeed the problem. You need roots like everybody else. Maybe the universe is asking y'all to reach a little bit further, just a little further back. During a time where, you know, let's say Swedish culture, very rich culture. It doesn't have much to do with the culture of oppression and degradation and colonialism, you know what I mean? And further back, you have these things that you can grasp a hold of. The very idea of American whiteness is an idea of forgetting. You couldn't speak that German when you came here. Couldn't speak that Gaelic when you came here. Couldn't speak that when you got here. You had to speak American English. And so when that all molded together, the idea of whiteness was set up diametrically opposed to the idea of anything else. And so when you reach for your roots, you bring back a hood. That is a problem. And so I think that that's what is being asked of the white population. Don't deny what happened in the name of whiteness. Don't sweep that under the rug. But understand that if you need that, that's probably where you should begin to look further.
And historically, if I have it right, Bob, there was a potato famine in Ireland in 1845. And so the Catholic Protestant issue was very overt there.
Yeah.
And when I think about 1 million Irish came to the United States at that time. So it blended with the end of the Civil War and this wave of Irish that came as well. So, you know, then the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish issue commingled, and now we also, you know, it is historical. You know, there's many prongs into this.
You know, it's important to remember how flexible the word white is. In the 19th century, the Irish were not considered white.
They weren't.
No.
Jews were not considered white. Okay? Russians were not considered white. Okay? And what we see is over time into the 20th century, particularly when Ellis Island replaced Plymouth Rock as our, if you will, our national myth, okay, our creation myth, if you will. And they had a little Frederick Jackson Turner to that, which is we took all these people who were different and the frontier made them Americans. But we have expanded the borders of whiteness to include the Irish, the Hungarians, the Italians. Okay? That is, in my mind, a defense, if you will, a border and a boundary to folks who aren't so white. But whiteness is flexible. It changes. And I would make an argument that Japanese Americans who were put in camps during World War II are now white if you look at their marriage patterns and you look at their friendship patterns. Okay? But the borders are very, very flexible. We don't think so. But if you look at law and you look at custom and you look at how government interacts with the immigrants coming in the early part of the 20th century, those folks, the borders of whiteness have expanded.
I think The Great Gatsby, which I taught as a high school teacher in Los Angeles, they call The Great Gatsby the great American novel, but I'm convinced, I've broken it down, that Daisy is passing for white. There was a marriage at the same time the Great Gatsby was written in the 1920s, and the gentleman found out that the woman had the one drop, and he sued her for divorce, and it was a big case in New York. It was, very sensational, and so that has been knit. There's code words. There's Daisy's husband and I can't remember the other characters. They're all sitting around, and Daisy's husband says, the thing is, you're white, and you're white, and you're white, but Daisy, and she winks. It's really actually explicit in there, but for whatever reason, and I think there was a gentleman, Broccoli, I think he's an expert on The Great Gatsby, for whatever reason, there's no discussion of this because it's, again, called the Great American Novel. And I suppose if this element surfaced, maybe it wouldn't be the Great American Novel. Every agent I went to for my book, I had to self-publish it, told me this story cannot sell. Every agent. They still tell me it can't sell, but it was on the local bestseller list for 11 weeks. It was the #1. I mean, it's...
What is that? Like, It's so frustrating. Like it's
Tell me how frustrating it is.
horribly frustrating to be. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You know, do what you gotta do.
Well, I was just wanting to make sure, sorry about that, Theo. What I do
cool,
want to
it's
make
cool.
sure, though, is that we do have time to get to some questions from the audience. And I don't know if you guys have been thinking of any. Give me 1 second. I am going to just go over the ground rules one more time to really ask you guys.
Hang on a sec. Let's have some respect for the speaker and put your hand down while she's speaking. That's fair.
Hold on. All right.
It's real.
Okay, so I am going to really quickly, so we are going to open up to questions from the audience. I'm going to go over the ground rules one more time. Our ground rules are that we are going to try to keep the conversation to talking about history, the history of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm happy to talk about how that affects us today, especially here in Colorado and in Golden. But I am going to ask everybody to please make sure that we stick away from modern politics, talking about modern elected officials and those types of things. So,
Kenny, before you start, I just want to thank the Golden Museum for having the courage to put on this program. I just really want to say thank you.
thanks, Charlie.
It's hope. Gives me hope.
Well, so, and then I will also point out too, since we do have, we are recording and we are going to have people watching, I'm not going to try to jump through the audience to bring the microphone to you, but if you want to just try to keep your question somewhat short, and then I can repeat it for the camera as well so that they can hear that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a local historian, and the 10,000 women in Arvada were marching to protect their Catholic Church. Okay, the burning of the KKK on the, on the
Table Mountain.
Golden. Those were marchers from Denver. What was going on in Denver is not
I
necessarily
don't think
what was
anybody,
going
I
on
don't
in
think
Golden.
anybody has said, I don't think anybody in the panel
Well, no,
indicated
it's
that
just
they were
you
Goldenites.
You need to understand that Denver is not Golden.
Oh, I understand that.
So I think that brings up an interesting question, and I'd love to have you guys delve a little bit more into that.
I'm not clear on the question.
Yeah, so I'll try to restate. I think my question, or the question should be about how was Golden involved in the Ku Klux Klan? And Bob, I don't know, that's kind of putting you on the spot.
It
I
is
know
putting
you
me on
did
the spot because
a statewide search.
my
but-
book looked at 5 communities. It looked at Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Denver, Grand Junction, and Canyon City. And those were places which had specific Klan, either strong anti-Klan activity or strong Klan activity. And so basically I focused on that. I also had membership lists for each of those places, whether the leadership membership list or the rank and file. So those are the communities I counted on. I never have ever believed that Golden was part of Denver. Okay, I understood that Table Mountain was a Klan, a Denver Klan retreat, if you will, and a place for convocations, as they called them, where they also brought Ben Stapleton and other leaders, political leaders, to Table Mountain to swear their allegiance to the Invisible Empire, which they did. They burned crosses on South Table Mountain, but I have never, in writing or publicly, announced that the Golden Klan was the same as the Denver Klan.
I just hope that Bob will put his book back in print because it is so well researched. No, I'm really serious. It was one of the basic. I mean, it's extraordinarily detailed in his research. Now, his book was one of the books that I researched. I think I read every book literally on the Klan that existed, and I lived in California at the time. I called on the Golden History museums from Pasadena. So this was 15 years ago. And I just came up to Golden one day. I wanted to thank someone. I didn't know who to ask to thank. And I think it was the visitor center I went to. And the young woman that was the docent that day, she wouldn't say it out loud, but she mouthed the words, "They're really not gone." She went, "They're really not gone." Now that's all I can tell you. Okay? She wouldn't say the words out loud, but that's what she said to me. Now it's not about a place per se. We're not accusing. I'm a proud Denver right now that I understand it, but it's inculcated in the fabric. There were restricted mortgages. A black person could not buy property. I don't know if anybody knows Denver, above Race Street. I lived on 26th and High as a child. Then you could not move above Colorado, York Street, then not above Colorado. And I remember the day the first black family moved on Monaco, and like a phone chain, there's a black family on Monaco, there's a black family. We were like so excited. They had broken through the barrier. So you have to understand there were, these things that were happening that were real. So I'm not accusing Golden, but somebody allowed them to come and stand on Table Mountain by the hundreds and thousands. Somebody did. Somebody said, okay, you can't come up here. Somebody did not say you cannot come here and have those meetings. Somebody did, and there's photographs there's proof that they were there.
Democracy is messy.
It is, I agree.
All right. Well,
Democracy
thank
is
you guys.
Very messy.
Thank you guys and for making those clarifications too. Do we have another question? Anybody else want to know? Let's go right back in the back. That's you. Sorry. Dale.
Yes, I've heard anecdotal stories from, I think, Tom Noel and others about the burning of the dance hall on top of South Table and the jazz group that was at the Rock Rest that escaped town before they could be captured by the Klan and had bad things done to them. Could you contribute to those two anecdotes?
Well, I do know Tom Noel, and I know his focus is pubs and saloons. Okay, so
very
I'm really
familiar
not
with
sure how
that, yeah.
viable a source he is for those. I am
Maybe
not
Dennis
aware
Gallagher.
of those particular incidents. I came across two incidents of Klan violence, where the Klan beat two people up, one Catholic, one a Jew. Came across a variety of incidents in regard to Klan threats. Ward Gash, a black janitor who was threatened early on.
The Gashes are friends of mine, family friends of mine. And Mr. Gash, I asked friend Renee, that's her great uncle, I think. They never knew he had to leave town, and the family never knew what happened to him. So they don't know if he was murdered. They don't know. So that's a real.
So when you look at Klan violence, not just in Colorado but across the United States, most Klan violence will occur in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, and it will occur in 1920, 1921, and into 1922. In 1922, in all those states, the Klan takes over the local government and takes over the police forces. So the Klan doesn't have to engage in extracurricular terrorism because they already have the official agency that's willing to keep social control going. In fact, after that period, you'll find as much Klan violence as you do anti-Klan violence in Ohio, in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire.
Any other questions, guys? Yeah, how about for you, sir?
Why did the KKK not like black, Muslim, or Jewish people?
Yeah, so the question from one of our younger participants in the audience, which thank you for that, is why was it that the KKK didn't like, was it black, Muslim, or Jewish people, was your question?
My friend,
That's Xavier.
how you doing, Zay? Look, to our best estimates, as none of us are Klan people, I can say that it was fear. It's all about being afraid of people. A fear of loss. A fear of becoming slaves on the land that our forefathers conquered, as Thomas Jefferson said. You have people who want to keep. And then there's people who are owed, who they're afraid are going to take it. Let's say I was in an abusive relationship before, right? Let's say I was the bad guy in that abusive relationship, hypothetically speaking. And after I had abused the girl that I had been with for so long, if we lived in the same house and I had a court order not to touch her, I'd be afraid of her because of what I had done to her. You see what I'm saying? And so I think that that's what it is. It's this idea that, I don't know, it's that guilty conscience thing. You know what I mean? They try to put certain organizations on the same level as the Ku Klux Klan morally. They cannot begin to achieve the kind of violence that they did. That creates a guilty conscience. And I think that that's what is part of it. And I'm afraid that we still have to grapple with this problem. But ultimately, the answer is being afraid of them, in my estimation, my humble perspective.
You know, I just want to throw something into this, which is a little off the topic, but not. So in 1856, the Democratic Party of South Carolina had the following slogan: "Freedom is not possible without slavery." And what that meant was those white Southerners who were poor, who were hardscrabble, who had these yeoman farms, they had to have slavery. Even if they didn't own slaves, they had to have slavery and support the system in order to maintain their own status. And the question was for these South Carolinians, how do I keep a floor between me and disfranchisement, slavery of my own kind? So I think Theo's got a great point about guilt. But there's also this real issue about how do I maintain myself, my power, my authority, my future, unless I'm able to keep people below me.
I was at a campaign few years ago, and the candidate said to the audience, "The thing is, we can't hand down to our children what was handed to us." And I said, "Well, sir, the issue is you're handing down what didn't belong to you." So, unfortunately, here we are. No one's casting aspersions at any particular person. But again, I reference that 1881 situation where people were removed from their lands of thousands of years. They were here. When I lived in Washington, D.C., Katie and I both lived in Washington, D.C. I lived there 10 years. And I can't think of the name of the creek.
Potomac?
No.
Bigger than a creek.
But not creek. It's runs through the.
That's all right.
Okay, but the military, the Native American group that lived on the banks of that river for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. The military gave them blankets infected with smallpox. Denver was founded at the confluence of the rivers where people lived for thousands of years. It's in the history books. Tom Noel has documented it really well. Others have. Those people were exterminated. Denver, beautiful Denver, fourth generation Denverite. People who lived there, and they were inconvenient. And the gold, and people wanted it, and you had to go. Sorry about that. Sand Creek, they shot women and children, massacred them. And the man who testified, he was murdered on Larimer Street, I believe. So unfortunately, we are on some very soft ground because the situation is bad in terms of how we got here. And we're all here now, so we're gonna have to figure it out together. It's not just one side is gonna pay the price, but we're all here and we have to figure it out.
So more questions? I think I saw the next hand go up right up here, if you're ready.
I have so many questions. I'm sitting here trying to figure out which one I want to ask you. And I want to ask, I think, a little bit about the name change of Stapleton. And trying to keep it historic, I thought the question that I could ask around that is, are there other communities or other situations in our country's history that have come up against something like changing the name of a neighborhood that have been successful, or that you could share with us something similar that might be instructional in terms of where people are?
Yeah. And just to repeat for the folks on the video, the question was about name changes, and particularly the neighborhood of Stapleton, and talking about it from a historic context. Thanks. About talking about has the idea of changing names because of poor associations in history and relationships to the Klan, has that been successful in other places? Has that come up in other places?
I don't know about a community, and maybe Bob, because he's might be more knowledgeable, but I just read, and I don't know if it's factual, that California changed the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe within that dialogue. There are places nicknamed, pardon me, Nigger Hill, that kind of thing, you know, which is now, you know, those names are being expunged. So it's a process. And Stapleton, I lived in Stapleton, but it's egregious to me that I know that he was the mayor when the airport was created, I believe. So he was living, and I guess they were honoring him. But the fact that they subsequently knew.
Listen, this is insane. If America was what America says it is, we wouldn't even have to fight to change the name.
That's a great point.
It is this momentum, this inertia, should I say, this inertia of European descended folk that we're dealing with here who for whatever reason, the convenience is addictive. We can't move on what's right because of convenience. And when the argument of privilege comes up, it doesn't show up in group. Male privilege, I'm dealing with male privilege right now. I just figured out I had this thing called male privilege, right? You know what I'm saying? To my whole life, being a black male was a detriment. But one thing I ain't afraid of is getting raped when I walk down the street. Every woman I know deals with that. That's right. The brass knuckles industry wasn't invented for me, right? But in group in males, I'm dealing with all kind of pecking order issues and stuff. Privilege shows up when the other comes. Inside group, there's nothing, you know, these people are crazy. Everybody, you know, I'm fighting my own, you know, I'm poor too, right? It shows up when the other comes. And when it's the other who's pressing. It's my organization, Shop Talk Live, who, like, my friend Quincy literally physically ran into the place and confronted them face to face about the Stapleton name. To my knowledge, he's the first one to ever do that. This big black guy said, "What is wrong with you guys?" You know what I'm saying? And so, but it's the inertia of convenience. It's the inertia of this is the way it is. Why are we dealing with this now? It was so long ago. You know what I mean? That I have to, that I'm developing the grit to fight through now. And that to me is, just look at that.
It's not just names of places. So I created a chart for myself. I needed to understand it myself. When my first year of teaching, I had a class of 12th graders. It was an elective class, again in Los Angeles. And I asked the students to write down on an index card, what did they want out of this class? I couldn't tell what they were trying to say. They graduated, those people. They told them they had been educated. I was so irate and horrified and scared for those children. They were functionally illiterate. They graduated, those people. I was told I required my students to have a library card and a dictionary. I was called into the principal's office, an African-American woman, wife of a minister, PhD, told I was causing problems because I required my English class students to have a library card and a dictionary.
How about that?
I did a chart. I created a chart for myself because literacy is my, you know, if you cannot read and write, you cannot function, period. So I created a chart of the Denver Public School System. So DSST, is it Denver School of Science and Technology?
That's right.
Their reading percentile is like 80, 92 or something. There are schools within DPS that have 0 reading proficiency. How is that possible within the same school district that you are allowing 0 reading proficiency? So it's not just the names of places, it's so much.
Did you have anything to add on that one?
I do. So Utah actually has a name-changing commission, specifically in regard to the use of the word squaw, for example, which is on over 1,000 different features in the American West. But in regard to that, in regard to several Black Americans in Utah history have had their names affixed to locations, not with the word black, but with something far more nasty.
Nigger Jim, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so there have been efforts to make changes in regard to that, and those have actually been affected. We've gone from nigger to Negro to black which I guess is, progress
I
in
guess,
the 20th
yeah.
century. But it's something. I think I want to part a little bit from Charlene in regard to this. I'm not entirely sure what to do in regard to the Stapleton name, because here's the thing. I have no problem in regard to these statues of Confederates in public parks, which are honorific statues. I have no problem doing something with that, at least removing them from honorific. Part of it is the erection of those things at least avoided half the population deciding that those things should be erected in those southern places. And after traveling through the South for the last 4 summers, I'm amazed that every single southern town, small town up, have statues commemorating the Civil War. Now note, not from the 1860s or 1870s. These are all daughters of the Confederacy erected between 1890 and 1920 and 1930. So it's not that generation of people who were soldiers. I have no problem with those being removed, not destroyed, but contextualized. Because if you decide to forget,
Like the Lorena Center collection.
you're not going to be able to remember. Okay? And what I've learned about after being a teacher for 40 years at universities is Americans don't know much about history.
They don't.
Okay?
They
And
don't.
they have an even smaller memory because history has become trivia to so many people. It's words and facts out of context. So if you decide, let's change this, okay, you have lost an opportunity in the future to constantly educate and re-educate and re-educate. Because what we have found, and I think what this panel is suggesting, is this stuff from the 1920s. We can go back 100, 200 years before that to talk about prejudice, and we can go another 100 years into the future to talk about prejudice today. Okay? So the question is, how do you educate younger people and ourselves constantly, continuously? I remember the first Earth Day in 1970. And the first Earth Day was, we're going to clean up the environment. And I thought, well, great, we're all on the same board, and we're not going to throw garbage. And then the next generation, it's all forgotten. And we have to re-educate and re-educate and re-educate. So losing the name means that you also lose the opportunity to say, hey, this happened here, this was wrong, this person is flawed for the following reasons. So that's one of my
That's a good
concerns.
point.
Well, there's this awesome thing called museums. And what they do is they hold our history. To have a statue built after you is not too different than having a neighborhood named after you. It's an honor. It means that you contributed something awesome to this place, and we should forever remember you for those contributions that you did, which were so great for us. So, like there's no statues in Germany to Hitler. We remember who he is. That guy's pretty known. Benjamin Stapleton can be the same. Don't write him out the history books. Hell, thicken the history books, please. You know what I mean? But to have an honor, if you're ambitious, I'm going to have, people say that. To make sure that, I don't think that the name Stapleton on a neighborhood is the thing that needs to happen for us to remember him. You know what I mean? Like there's other ways to do it. That's just my 2 cents on it.
And I would say, I know from what I've witnessed that there's a lot of historians, a lot of educators, a lot of people who care a lot about the past who have very different feelings on that. So I think it's kind of interesting to hear all sides of that. And we can leave that one there and you guys can all discuss afterwards, I think,
That's a big issue.
on your opinions. But Stacy in the back. And we only have a few more minutes, but let's get a couple more questions in.
Yeah, I have a question. Were there some people that were swept in? I loved when you talked about, that in the Civil War, how this thing started back then. But I've read different books, and you always wonder which one is the right story and who's telling stuff. But were there some people that were swept up into this thinking it was a fraternal organization, or did they know, or did it change along the way? And because I heard some people try to get out of it when they found out what it was, and they couldn't. They were like owned by it.
Yeah, and to repeat for the cameras, the question is about, were there people who joined the Ku Klux Klan thinking that it was just a fraternal organization and getting together with the buddies, who didn't understand the kind of racial goals of the organization?
I think Bob can best answer that, but there again was pressure to join. You're not going to have this job unless I get your membership, or your families your family might want to look out for your family if you don't join. So there's that.
Well, let's start with that. So when shop owners or factory owners were decided to join the Klan, they were expected to bring their employees into the Klan as well. Okay, so a lot of people joined the Klan in order not to lose their jobs. A lot of these merchants who paid money to have their business name flashed on the wall at a Klan meeting. This is somebody you have to patronize. They were doing this for economic reasons. They were worried about a boycott because Catholics and Jews were being boycotted, and those Protestants who showed too much sympathy toward minorities, they were boycotted as well. So there was economic pressure. Ben Stapleton was a real opportunist. Let's start with that. He was an opportunist who wanted to run for office, and he wanted to win. And he found his vehicle to win, okay? So do I consider him necessarily nasty, evil, whatever? I don't know, but I know that he was an opportunist. I know that he had some tolerance for the prejudice that exists, and these fraternal people had some tolerance for the prejudice. But what also happens is, as the Klan shows its colors, because the Klan policemen also went on the bribe and were corrupt as well, people said, whoa, I got talked into something here, and I want to get out. Now, it wasn't hard to get out. And people did get out, a lot of numbers. There was lots of people before the split with the Minutemen in 1925, a lot of desertions, okay, and a diminishing of the group. So it wasn't such a Nazi-like or authoritarian regime that you couldn't get out. And people did say, I made a mistake. Or they said, crime has been cleaned up. The Catholics really weren't doing anything. We thought they were. The Jews aren't as bad as I thought they were. So they left. So I interviewed about 24 Klansmen, former Klansmen, and found a variety of reasons for people to leave. I also found a variety of people who were so upset that the Klan dissipated because they were so prejudiced. They were terribly anti-Semitic. They were terribly black. They were terribly anti-Catholic. And they were sad that the Klan faded away.
In the Lorena Center collection, if I have this right, Jim, there's a couple of letters. So Newsteaders, does everyone remember Newsteaders? Downtown was an upscale store owned by a Jewish family, I believe. So there are letters from Klan women who saw their associates going into Newsteaders. And so they were called out. If we saw so-and-so going into Newsteaders, you better reckon with that person. So that's documented. I encourage everybody to go to see the Lorena Center collection. Take schools, tell people. It's a resource. And her daughters, I think, donated. So I applaud them because can you imagine having that attached to you? But they did a wonderful thing to help us to remember. It's like going to see the gas chambers, but thank gosh it's proof.
So we're talking about Klansmen. We can also talk about anti-Klansmen. One of the groups I'm really interested in is those people who kind of didn't choose a side. And so, and let me go from that to something else, which is I did a piece of an article on the civil rights movement in San Antonio, Texas during the early 1960s, which was the first to integrate its lunch counters, the first to integrate the municipal pool and whatever. And I would talk to a variety of these people. And I remember speaking to one person in particular, an attorney who was in the city government, and I said, this was a segregated community. You had signs in regard to drinking fountains, signs in regard to bathrooms. And I said, why didn't you ever protest this? Why didn't you do something about this? And his response was, obeying segregation signs were like obeying traffic lights. You did them without even thinking. And so I'm really intrigued, and this goes back to the Mountain Meadows Massacre in Utah, which is, how about these people who said, it doesn't matter to me. I really don't care. Yeah, I can vote for a member of the Klan despite what I know about him. Yeah, so those are the people that this group within the middle who knew that somebody, Clarence Morley, was a member of the Klan running for governor and still voted for Clarence Morley. Okay, those are the questions I have about what motivates the great majority of people who don't join or don't oppose.
There's just so many facets. So my father taught me golf when I was a little girl, but he took me to a vacant lot to teach me. He bought a little golf bag, because at the time, City Park Golf Club, a golf course, was segregated. Golf, I mean, there's so many nuances, there's so many facets. People, I ski, my father taught me to ski. Well, black skiers were not welcome on the mountain, you know. I mean, it just goes on and on. It's just not just the name of a community, it's just on and on. To that woman not being willing to shake my hand in a church during a service, you know, to...
It just reminds me of what Martin Luther King said, the most segregated, most racialist time is Sunday morning.
It is. I tried to get the two pastors of those two churches to, at least for the choirs, to come to the different, 5 years, couldn't get it done.
Yeah, so I think we have time for just one more question, and I'll go to the gentleman here in the third row.
Thank you. And I think it's a relevant question given the last topic. Let me offer something as an explanation for what you asked about why racism or the Klan hates certain people. Also something that might be encouraging by offering that if we look at white supremacy, it's not whiteness. White supremacy is fascism, it's totalitarianism, it's authoritarianism. It oppresses everybody. Let me just read a quick passage from Dr. King at the end of the Selman and Montgomery speech, march. He says, it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. Yes, sir, he gave him Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was white, better than a black man. Wow. And this is the great American hustle, right? We have created a society where we settle for less because someone else has less. And the thing about racism, Xavier, is that it's not something deeply ingrained and built into our DNA, but it's something created to control people. It's something created to let people decide to have less than they deserve. And if I can take from the lowest person on the totem pole, then the person that I am now gets elevated, but I'm not really living up to the full potential. So the question for you all is there sort of a remaking of the American myth that points out the folks like Ben Lindsay, who stood up against Mayor Stapleton, who stood up against the Klan, creating a mythology of people who resisted these values of totalitarianism and saying, look, you could be a white person and not be an asshole.
But Ben Lindsay was voted out of office, so
exactly.
But he did have the courage to stand up.
Right, and he was voted out of office partly because he resisted the Klan.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a history of just white totalitarianism and terrible people doing terrible things. There's John Henry. There's people that we have subverted from our history who are white, who represent a mythology that doesn't get told because the powers that be still enjoy separating people and dividing them.
I think that really what works in well with what I had planned as our last question, and so maybe we can kind of combine our two questions together here with that. Something that really struck me in preparing for this panel is the idea that the Ku Klux Klan hold on Colorado, it really isn't that far in the past, right? I mean, this is the 1920s, right? We've talked about slavery and we've talked about all sorts of other things that have been happening in America's past, but I'm sure that many of our parents and grandparents were alive when this was happening here in Colorado. And as historians, we often notice that aspects of history tend to repeat themselves, and in many different ways they tend to repeat themselves in different permutations. But so I want to know a little bit about what you guys think people can do as historians, as lovers of history, as people who just live in Colorado to help make sure that we don't repeat this dark history of discrimination and that we remember this time period in the way that it should be remembered, and so that we can make sure to, better the future.
Do you want me to go first?
It's a big question.
John Hope Franklin, who is a very famous African-American historian, once said to me that as a minority, you always have to educate. You always have to educate. You can never take anything for granted. And basically I dedicated my life to education. I've been teaching since 1977. I teach 20th century American history class. One of my key focuses is race, because I think it is a fault line in American history that doesn't seem to close up. Okay? And there are many books written on those who basically were noisome in history, who made a stink. Okay? Well-behaved people, as another one of my colleagues says, never make history. Okay? And I want to tell you, as historians, and we are a very liberal left-wing crowd, even at the University of Utah. Okay? And we are constantly beating that drum. But what I want to say in general is history has gone out of fashion. Okay? We don't study history anymore in school. We study social studies, which means a plethora of different things. But there is a lack of appreciation for history. Political leaders have no sense of history. History is molded and wrapped to create a lie so many times. So I'm still at it. I'm still in the trenches. I'm still making my cause. And to see a group this large come out is just amazing to me in this day and age, because we are so wrapped up in media and so wrapped up in the technology, we seem to have forgotten the ability, we seem to have lost the patience to sit and listen to a lecture, a panel, or read a book. But to me, it has to be education. Always, over and over and over again. Because if it doesn't, it's gone.
Well, first of all, I hope, really hope that Professor Robert Allen Goldberg will have his book back in print, because it's, I mean, no, really, it's just, I mean, it's a wealth of resource. It's just awesome. So, Annie, but to Nathan and Katie and Megan and everyone connected with Golden Museums, and we were to have a program last night in Denver. Ironically, it was canceled because there was an alleged incident regarding a Confederate flag at a student football game. I don't know the details, but they felt it would be unsafe to have the program last night at the school. That the principal, stepped up and offered, said, yes, you absolutely can have this here, but yesterday morning it was canceled. So you have that happen last Friday, and then, is this Saturday? This is Saturday. Yes, apparently this week, the situation at the Air Force Academy. I personally do not have the answers. As I told you, I'm struggling to kind of find out who I am without. Sometimes I'm not. I love being I'm a proud black woman, because I've had to be. That's my context. But I just wonder who I'd be if I was just Charlene Porter. I just wonder. I'm curious. I don't know. And sometimes I have days when I try to just be a person. Not a black person, not a woman, just a person. I never succeed, really, because there's always something that lets me know, So, and I imagine everybody's probably trying to struggle with that, maybe with it's your age. I'm reached a certain age where I'm struggling with that, we always have something that we're all trying to figure out. But that you are here today and we are having a civil, respectful, informed, in-depth, honest, that's conversation. Gosh, that's so encouraging. That's just so wonderful. Annie and Bob traveled, they were willing to come. Katie and Nathan and Megan were willing to plan. We're going to try to reprogram the program in Denver.
Theo came.
Pardon me, Theo.
That's fine. That's all right. I was thinking y'all was getting
Theo.
Yeah.
His booming, awesome voice.
Oh, thank you.
So, again, I'm encouraged. I'll just say that. And if we can, it's hard, everybody, there's a lot going on. It's a very sensitive time. We're all kind of confused by everything. But if we could just try, and there's going to be pushback. There is going to be pushback. It's hard. It's hard. And again, the history doesn't lend itself to. It's a very complex history. So I don't know. Thank you. I'm just so grateful. Thank you.
No, it's all good. You want to stop this in the future, I say count the bodies then. There's a thing that I said, that, all right, they sprang up in the historical vacuum. I spoke to a school one day and I said, a great crime has been committed against white kids. A crime, a literal crime. And that is, you were handed this shining empire. Just handed it. And they only told you about the assets, not the liabilities. That's fraud. You get thrown in jail for that. And now you got these brown and black folks, red folks around like the telltale heart, thumping in the basement, right? And you got no context for what they are. We're just the ghosts of empire walking around trying to remind you of what was buried. Count the bodies. And because of that crime, I would say that there is this thing that white folks got to address their wounding too. Then the emotional intelligence to discern the difference between white guilt and literal moral accountability is not there. There is this guilt thing that happens, and guilt is an evasive emotion, but without it, you're a sociopath. You need it. So guilt is good in context because it points your moral compass back on the right track north. It says, if this is there, let me investigate and live with this really quickly before I get all defensive about it. Start fighting back, because there's two ways that I found the alt-right process this guilt. One of them was to just, European descendants in general just freaking fell into a horrible guilt cycle. And folks was apologizing to me, I don't know you, you just saying sorry, that don't help either. You know what I mean? But then there's also this thing where they began on a fault-finding mission with black folks and people of color. Epic fault-finding mission to hopefully balance the scales. And the teachers in this new internet movement did historical revision by minutia. They got them lost in the weeds. Some battles the Native Americans did win, and they were brutal when they won. They'll say, well, what about this battle that the Indians won? You know what I mean? And it distracts them from what was the net outcome of conquest. You know what I mean? So if you count the bodies, if you get real about this moral compass and the emotional intelligence to discern between guilt and literal moral accountability, and I would say finally, watch the seeds are dropping into the minds of these kids. I was wounded in 2014. I'm a police brutality survivor. I got handcuffed to a chair and beaten, and I thought, oh, this is how I end, right? And in 2014, when Eric Garner got killed by the police, that old scab popped open, and I was having a difficult time dealing with white folks, if I must be honest with you. You know what got me on the right track? Working with children. Working with children. These kids didn't know me from Adam. These white kids, blue eyes, black kids, brown eyes, Latino, Asian kids, you name it. A kid has a chance, dude. Don't poison them. Let them know. Sort out your crap before you start, planting seeds in their minds. You know what I mean? And whatever differences there are between the races, there may be some inherent differences. I tell you what, it ain't enough to do what we've done. And if we can get that on the right track, we got some hope for the future. That's all.
Well, I just really quickly, guys, I'll stand up for this one so I can see all the way to the back. But thank you all so very much for being here. Let's do one more round of applause, guys. Thank you so much.